Hi guys, this stream is not going to be a particularly long one. I kind of just wanted to talk about the death penalty. I've kind of been thinking about the death penalty. Interesting topic. One of these things that obviously it's not a penalty that can be applied in every case. Um, it's only used in extreme circumstances, and generally speaking, only certain crimes can warrant the application of the penalty. Um, However, I wonder whether the penalty should ever be applied. And that doesn't come from a place of pacifism or a place of compassion or a place of my opposition to the death penalty comes more from a place of concern with mercy or with justice than mercy, where usually opposition to the death penalty comes from a place of mercy rather than justice. So I think the death penalty, my feelings on the death penalty are this. Um, I I think the dead get off easy, and I think that if we are if we assume that there are crimes that warrant the application of the penalty, I think that if a person is already facing life in prison, they would prefer the death penalty to continued life in prison. And to me, it seems far more proportional to a serious crime, um, like murder or rape or some form of fatal assault, or life in prison seems actually to be a more severe penalty than the death penalty, in the sense that the dead get off easy. Right? If I'm in the sense that the death penalty seems viscerally valid, right? We have this, and justice often comes from our viscera, right? I mean, our sense of justice is very visceral, and it's not always logically valid. And I think when it comes to the death penalty, if you kill, you should be killed, is the feeling behind it. And so, in the sense of punishment proportionality, letting the punishment fit the crime, viscerally, it seems fair that yeah, if a person commits murder, takes the life of another, they deserve to have their life be taken. And the sense of how we feel about what one deserves is separate from what is actually appropriate as a punishment. Because when we critically evaluate whether the death penalty is proportional to a serious crime in which the penalty would be applied, like murder or rape, I don't know if the death penalty is applied for rape. I'm not exactly sure. In some states, it might be federally. I'm not exactly sure if there's a federal criminal code, but regardless, the idea that the uh, the idea that it's the idea of something feeling just or feeling correct, and the idea of it being valid and it being, and so when I think about, I mean, it seems to me that the dead do get off easy, and that if I'm assuming that there are crimes for which there should be severe penalties, and we could go into the debate about whether punishment or rehabilitation is a better model for treating offenders and serious offenders, and we could get into that debate. I think I generally, as a person, lean more toward rehabilitation than punishment, although I think punishment plays a part in rehabilitation, and I think that it has a role in creating deterrence against behaviors that we would deem very socially disadvantageous, very unethical, even outside of a utilitarian perspective, such as taking the life of another person, fatally assaulting them, or assaulting another person in a sexual way, which particularly damages an individual's self-esteem and agency, and often causes severe mental issues related to trauma that people just simply don't recover from. And so, I mean, yeah, these are serious crimes against against humanity in some sense. But my feeling on the death penalty is, if I'm assuming that it should be applied in certain cases, I prefer for any one of those crimes that life in prison should be recognized as more severe, more proportional a punishment to those crimes than the death penalty, where it seems that the death often serves as a kind of escape route out of a life in prison, outside of a life of confinement. And we could get deeper into the debate about whether rehabilitation or punishment are more appropriate societal responses to these types of acts. Like I said, I think punishment has immense deterrent effects, and so it's valuable from a social utilitarian perspective. Um, but that ultimately it's not punishment that will correct a person's underlying issues that caused the criminal act, right? Someone who does commit, murders or serial murders from a place of malice, or commits rape from a place of malice. If the commission of a crime points to real malice, then I don't know if I believe that anyone is necessarily evil. I think the types of people that you see in prisons who've committed these types of crimes, gang crimes, um, uh, serious forms of assault, murder, rape, um, serious theft. Uh, these people aren't necessarily evil. They've just kind of had their uh, good, in my more compassionate attitude toward these types of people. They've just been mistreated by life and the world, to whatever that means, and things, they're damaged rather than evil. And maybe they're also suffering from psychopathy, which is a kind of it's as much a medical condition as much a psychological condition as the other. Psychopathy and sociopathy, um, they shouldn't be equated to a person being genuinely malicious, because often what a psychopath is being incapable of seeing from another perspective, of empathizing, of feeling compassion or feeling of kinship with other people. And so that inability to feel empathy is itself, in my view, a medical condition that they have no control over, and that's what makes them a psychopath. So that the idea that psychopathy should be punished rather than treated, um, and that similarly with drug crimes, addiction should be punished rather than treated, is to me very wrong. And if I'm having to take a position on whether I'm a rehabilitationist or a punishment-oriented person when it comes to my feelings on criminal justice, I would say that I'm very strongly lean toward rehabilitation. But I also recognize that punishment exerts deterrence. At least the threat of punishment exerts deterrence. And so I'm, in the sense, I accept that punishment is valid from a utilitarian perspective. It exerts deterrence. However, I also recognize that it's not effective for rehabilitation, which is an equally important thing for those who are not serving life in prison. Now, maybe when it comes to individuals who are serving life in prison, rehabilitation doesn't matter. I still think it does, because it affects the psychology of the inmate and their life experience. And we're obligated to, via the, I guess, I won't go off onto that point. I don't think it's related too much to what I'm talking about. But in any case, those are my feelings on the death penalty, and whether it actually is a consistent with principles of proportionality and punishment. And I don't think it is, even for the worst crimes. I think life in prison is far worse. And if we're going to, I feel that the threat of life in prison and incarceration, right, which is a constant state of deprivation. When you're incarcerated, you're incarcerated. You have no freedom. Total loss of, and if we assume that humans seek freedom primarily of some kind, freedom and happiness, and the lack of that fundamental thing is itself a kind of extreme deprivation. And so the threat of life in prison is, I think, enough to exert deterrence, although the death penalty, inflicted on enough people, right, if we're speaking in terms of deterrence and from a utilitarian perspective, may be beneficial to society. So we may have to apply it in some cases to exert those deterrent effects. We just have to calculate, we'd have to quantify how much, we'd have to quantify the level at which we should apply it, if that's the logic we're going for. But I think in terms of basic principles, not thinking from utility, but from ethics, not from what's useful, but from what's right, that perspective, if right exists, then, and I mean, what is right and what is useful, they're very entangled. You can't really define what is right without reference to utility. But in my view, it's far more proportional to a serious crime to just apply the penalty of life in prison rather than the death penalty, because the dead do get off easy. And I think anyone would prefer death to spending life in prison. And I think that the death penalty, even though it viscerally is valid for certain crimes, logically speaking, it doesn't actually end up being very proportional. So, but it's interesting how justice is very visceral, and what we feel is justice very visceral. And it's very, and the reason it's visceral is because it's very difficult to define what is good and what is just. And so we ultimately have to rely upon our feelings to make these judgments. Well, we don't have to, we just do. And that is probably regrettable and not a good tendency, speaking generally, but it's what people do when they make judgments about these types of things. And so, especially with committing murder, right? You know, murderers are regarded as proven murderers anyway, and even unproven murderers, even those accused of murder, are regarded as, right, the worst kind of human being. So, I mean, the are regarded. I'm not saying I would regard them as, right, but are regarded by others. And so, you know, it's just interesting to me that the death penalty feels like a better punishment for really serious crimes for most people, when life in prison seems to be a far worse form of punishment. And why we rank severity, rank the punishments according to severity. We put the death penalty above life in prison, to me, seems to be very strange. In other societies at other times, principles of proportionality and the rule of visceral justice, I'll call it, was far more intense. And so, you know, an eye for an eye, you steal a loaf of bread, you get your hand cut off, which isn't proportional in my opinion, obviously, but you get the point. Far more primitive. That's unproportional. Bad example, but you get my point, right? So eye for an eye kind of justice is that visceral justice that I'm talking about. A life for a life. You commit murder, you get murder. I mean, you know, you take a life, you lose a life. It all seems viscerally very correct, and proportionality is what we deem proportional is entirely visceral. There's no logical reason that a life for the principle of a life for a life is entirely, and our idea of how that's proportional is entirely visceral. It's not logical. And so we have to check the impulse to want to make a judgment about whether something is right on our visceral impulses, and we have to consider things logically and see if it actually makes sense, both from a logical and a purely logical, and from a utilitarian perspective. So, but yeah, the dead get off easy, and I think oftentimes if we're going to apply the death penalty as a penalty for certain crimes, either to exert deterrence or to seek justice, because those are separate things. You can definitely achieve deterrence and violate justice and seek justice without achieving deterrence. I mean, it's a difficult balance to strike between justice and deterrence. But yeah, that's what I think about the death penalty. And, you know, now maybe I'm not considering this from all angles, and maybe I'm not considering this from all angles, and maybe I would need more time to reflect. The idea that the dead get off easy and that life in prison is worse than the death penalty, you know, that's a presumption that I'm making, you know, also based on maybe some visceral component in my thinking, but, you know, so maybe I'm lapsing. I'm stepping into a hypocrisy by making the judgment that one is worse than the other, criticizing visceral feelings of justice and that sense of visceral proportionality when I'm engaging in it and critiquing it. So, fully willing to admit that, but not sure. I think thinking about it critically is not relying upon the visceral; it's relying upon the logical. But you know, regardless, the death penalty is and whether it even if it is proportional, should it be applied, even for the sake of deterrence, when life in prison will do for creating deterrence. Prison penalties create deterrence just like the death penalty does. Why do we need it? If we can achieve deterrence either way, now, I only said it was useful for deterrence. And if it isn't even necessary for creating deterrence, why do we need it at all, right? So I don't even know if I wouldn't advocate for the death penalty in general. I'm just saying that if we're going to assume that we have the death penalty, and if I'm forcing myself to advocate for it, well, then I would say that it's a less severe punishment than life in prison, and should only be applied in a utilitarian sense for the sake of deterrence, and not necessarily for proportionality, because it isn't very proportional, because the debt get off easy. And so, but whether I think it should be applied at all is another question. I think it's a very primitive form of punishment. And if a person can genuinely be rehabilitated, we can learn about how to rehabilitate people through trying to rehabilitate them, then, we should do so. But, it's just, so in any case, however, a person, maybe the death penalty in certain instances is proportional. A person facing death, that's an extreme terror, right? You're on death row, you're living every day with the pain and the misery of knowing that you're about to die, right? So maybe it is proportional. Maybe maybe, but it's only a maybe. So I mean, I don't know. But in general, I do think that most people facing life in prison and death wouldn't look to death with fear or pain, but rather hope and relief. So in any case, those are my feelings on the death penalty. Principles of proportionality, the idea of visceral justice, and how we decide what is just and how it isn't really logical. It's more visceral. And that really, I oppose the application of the death penalty, not from a place of mercy, but of justice. And if I'm assuming the death penalty has to exist and it needs to be applied, and that I have to advocate for it, well, then that's kind of the argument I would make, or at least the commentary that I would provide on the issue. But maybe with this channel, what I would want to do is speak about general issues first, and then start getting into specific, maybe, news items, and talk about some news updates or recent policy developments of the death penalty. I'll look that up right now and see if there have been. Make it a little bit more relevant, because otherwise it feels very abstract. Just type news on the death penalty. Death penalty. Yeah, so public support for the death penalty has fallen, according to this article, from 80% in the mid-90s to about 55%, according to a Gallup poll. That's very interesting. That makes sense. I think that we are moving in a more progressive direction with regard to the death penalty. Not so much a conservative direction as much. Yeah. And I'd like to know the law on the death penalty, like where it's applied. Yeah, how many countries even still have it? So this is an article from the BBC. And this is a basic question, so we really shouldn't doubt the source on this one. Yeah, so the top 10 countries by number of executions. The top country at this point is China. And they have, the numbers indicate the figure is a minimum. I'm guessing this is per year, or number of executions in what period of time. In any case, China, at this ranking system, which is vague, I'm guessing it's per year. China is the top, the application of the execution as a method of punishment. China is the top. Iran is second. Saudi Arabia is third. Iraq fourth. Egypt fifth. and the U.S. is 6th. That surprises me. I'd expect the U.S. to be higher on this list, but that is maybe me just being a bit myopic and not considering that in the third world and less developed progressive countries are going to have more of that anyway. It's interesting to me, though, that in China, execution as a form of punishment is popular at that level. That actually does surprise me. In China, very interesting. Progressive in other ways, right? But I guess not on that issue. They probably recognize that it has deterrent effects, and I think China and its philosophy and a lot of its policies tend to be more utilitarian. So they would recognize the utilitarian benefits of the deterrence effect of the application of the penalty. So Iran doesn't surprise me, but I think for other reasons. I don't even know if they would call it the death penalty in Iran or if it would be formalized. I'm not exactly sure. But in any case, that's some information on the death penalty. And know that too. Let's see. And let's see here. Death penalty hits historic lows despite federal execution spree. Yeah, so the death penalty is active in your red states. And it's limited in your blue states, more limited in your blue states, but in your very blue states, it's very, very minimal. That's not surprising to me. Colorado becomes the 22nd state to abolish the death penalty. The 22nd state to abolish the death penalty. So in the United States, there are at least 22 states that abolish the death penalty. That's almost half. That's very interesting. So that's some news on the death penalty. If you'd enjoy that, more of that content. But wow, almost half of the United States does not even use it. It's abolished. It's not even a form of punishment in those states. So that's probably moving in a better direction, more logical direction. Death row by state. So this is, I guess, the number of people on death row per year, which doesn't say much. I mean, they really should give you the number that are put onto death row each year, because people stay on the death row for multiple years. Yeah. So the highest is actually California, but that doesn't say that California is conservative on the death penalty. It just means it has a higher population. But accounting for population size, I'd say that comparing maybe two small states, like Oregon and Kentucky, are about equal, even though Oregon is blue and Kentucky's red. In any case, that's some information on the death penalty. But good news, I guess, that in the United States, almost half of the United States have, which doesn't actually say anything. That's only to say that half of the states, the number of states. It doesn't say that. It's not saying half of the country. So, or maybe that's the same thing, but there seems to be a distinction there. Wow. Yeah. Cool. So this is this article that I'm looking at. It's the Death Penalty Information Center. I'm not sure if Death Penalty Information Center. So it's neutral, just provides information on it. States, it's got a cool graphic here, so I can sift for information and then it'll represent the information visually for me. States with death sentences. I can give you a list of maybe some of the, for the one viewer who's streaming in right now, I can give you some of the states that do still have the death penalty. Yeah, so I mean, Texas, Arizona, looks like New Mexico, Louisiana. So yeah, those are all states that still currently have the death penalty. So In any case, yeah, those are my thoughts on the death penalty, maybe some news about the death penalty, maybe some information that you have not yet been exposed to. So thank you for watching.